everybody. I've been given the thumbs up, so I think we can start. My name's Simon Reveley, and I'm the CEO of Figment Productions, a company based in Guildford, which for some of you sounds like the back of beyond, but it's half an hour down the road, down on the train. We've grown up in Guildford from a group of people who've worked together for probably about 15 years now, and we've grown into working in the visitor attractions industry. We do other work too. We work in the corporate sector, work with museums and heritage clients, but our biggest work is in the visitor attractions industry. So we're going to talk today a little bit about the impact of VR on visitor attractions, and I was going to cover a couple of projects that we've done and talk about some of the production techniques. I presume, with the nature of the event, that most people in the room have got some production experience themselves, so I'm going to focus more on some of the challenges we faced making this stuff rather than the more sort of customer-facing bit. So I'm going to talk about two projects that we've done. One is Galactica, which is the world's first roller coaster fully dedicated to virtual reality. The words had to be very carefully chosen to be a world's first. And Darren Brown's Ghost Train, which is at Thorpe Park. So it's very important to talk about the team at this point, because I obviously don't do all this on my own. So here are some of the Figment team, and this is our Christmas party, or the moment before we left the studio for the Christmas party. It's handy having a green screen in the back of the office. So what you see here is a mixture of our team. We're now about 50-ish, 52, 53 permanent staff, and then about another 20 or 30 contractors who come in for our busy period, which is now. And what you see here is, apart from some fairly interesting costumes, is a mix of developers, CGI artists, filmmakers, designers, and engineers. And then there's some project managers and people who have to do the real work scattered in there as well. I just wanted to throw, no presentation's the same without a quote, so I thought I'd better get the quote out of the way. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I think it couldn't be more true than when you're working in VR. If anyone's read Creativity Inc., I think it's called, the Ed Catmull book, he references this, and the fact that at Pixar, this phrase it's kind of sacrosanct. And I think if you're working in VR particularly, it's a really, really useful tenet to live by. And I'll tell you why as we get into some of this work. So the first project is Galactica, and some of you may have been on Galactica, I don't know, but Galactica was originally a roller coaster called Air at Alton Towers. It was about 15 years old when we took control of it, and we added VR onto the coaster. Now, there's a lot of talk about VR on roller coasters. I don't know how many of you know much about theme parks, but in the theme park industry, VR is making quite a big impact at the moment. And the most obvious use of it is to do this kind of thing. So there are other people out there doing VR on a roller coaster, and this isn't a sales pitch, so I'm not going to go into the major differences. But what I will say you're going to see in this presentation here is some of the challenges we faced, because we had the ambition and the brief from the client that they wanted everybody on the ride to have VR all day, every day, throughout the whole year. So it wasn't a case of picking up a Gear VR off a shelf and handing it to someone in the queue. This had to be running permanently, and we had a target of trying to reach a significant number of people an hour. So we couldn't allow the ride to be killed off by the fact that VR takes a little while to get right. Obviously, you've got to put your headset on, you've got to adjust it, and in the theme park industry, you're dead if you don't meet your throughput requirements. So if you take a ride from being 1,000, 1,500 an hour and drop it down to 300 people an hour, then that project will not last beyond the first week, because that is unviable. So one of our challenges was how we get people to use VR quickly. And as any of you in the room will know, if you've spent time looking at VR and listening to all the babble in the VR industry, most people say it takes about 4 minutes to adjust yourself to VR. This ride's over in 4 minutes, so we had to decide that rule was wrong and pull it off a lot quicker. So the way that we did it was we created a system called Vector. Vector VR is our motion synchronization system, and it evolved pretty quickly. It started off with It really started off with a toothbrush, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. The first bit of VR that I ever worked on was actually 2006. It's off the other side, and I hadn't realized that it was VR until someone told me it was VR recently, which I think is an interesting topic because VR is essentially immersive entertainment, I think. Most people just seem to think VR means strapping a phone to your head or something similar. But actually, people have been doing VR for a long time, sometimes with headsets and sometimes without. The first thing that I actually did was called the Interactive Dive Cage, which was a big, it's 12 50-inch plasma screens wrapped around in a 270, and you'd stand in the middle and you can reach out and touch stuff, and sharks would swim up to you and do that kind of stuff. That was in 2006. This is probably more legitimately classed as VR. This was a job we did for the British Army in 2009, and that's using a projection system. So if any of you know about caves, caves are a kind of usually a three-sided projection room, and you would put something usually on your head which tracks your position, and it means that with a flat projected wall you can look around objects and the point of view changes. And that's kind of what we did here for the army. So you'd have a shooting range with various objects in the way, and you could look around those objects to find the targets. That was an interesting example of fail fast and fail frequently, because if we'd lived by that adage, we wouldn't have had the problems we had with that project. We were using a magnetic tracking system, and it wasn't until a few weeks before this went live that we realized putting a magnetic tracking system inside a metal shipping container full of steel bars wasn't going to work. Now I feel stupid saying that, but at the time it was two worlds colliding in terms of us doing the technology bit and somebody else doing the actual environment that it was going into. So we ended up using an acoustic tracking system for that, which looked a bit like this actually. It had metal bars with little speakers on, and on your head you'd wear a microphone, and as you moved around, the different frequencies of the speakers would tell the computer where you were based on what you were hearing. So anyway, that's a waffly start to the story. Oculus first came on the scene around 2013-ish, bit before that, but 2013. And then September 2014, Oculus's partnership with Samsung produced the Gear VR. And we were already playing with other things. We were already working with DK2 and DK1, as lots of people probably in this room were. And then when the Gear VR came out, I suddenly thought, blimey, our biggest client owns a lot of roller coasters. Wouldn't it be amazing to do this on a roller coaster? I had that thought brushing my teeth, which is why I mentioned the toothbrush earlier. Because I find the best thoughts come to you in the weirdest places, usually the shower, or something about bathrooms are really stimulating, I think. So I had this idea about the fact that mobile phones were enabling VR, and I realized that mobile phones could also enable synchronization of movement. The reason being the IMU, the inertial measurement unit, most people just refer to the accelerometer, which is one part of that. So the thing in your phone that allows you to swivel a picture when you turn it sideways. I realized that that same thing could make us do VR on a roller coaster. So what you're actually seeing here is our Blue Peter prototype, where we had mobile phones strapped onto the harness of the coaster, very carefully and safely strapped onto the harness of the coaster. And then we had some Gear VRs with a lot of tie clips and a lot of gaffer tape to make sure everything stayed on the ride. And the theory was that if you were to record the movement of an IMU, of a sensor, if you get that pattern of rotational movement, that when you're on a fixed path, like a roller coaster track, that pattern of movement would always be the same, because it can't suddenly change. It wouldn't work free roaming, but on a fixed path it does. So that's how our vector system works. We soon realized that you can't do that with mobile phones because they can't cope with the G-force, so we switched into different sensors. But essentially it's the same idea. The idea was you use a mobile phone to map the track and then use it to play it back again. So that was late 2014. We were lucky enough, we were already actually working on Darren Brown's Ghost Train at the time, and I was lucky enough to get into a conversation with the right person at the right time, mentioned to him that I'd had this idea and could I borrow a roller coaster. And he said, actually, at Alton Towers, we're thinking of doing this, so why don't you come and talk to us? So I did, and we managed to get access to this amazing coaster called Air. So we started working on the coaster itself in late 2014, and in March 2015, we did a proof of concept session where a lot of senior guys from Merlin who own Alton Towers came along, and the Alton Towers senior team, and they all tried it, and they literally said, wow, that's the future. So from then, we kicked into the project properly, and the result was that in March this year, Galactica opened to the public. So just backtracking ever so slightly, following on that idea of failing fast and failing frequently, we started off with mobile phones because that's where the concept came from. And as we realized that they flatline at certain G-forces, we then worked with other sensors. And we started off with off-the-shelf consumer-level electronics to build something quickly, put it together, see if it worked, find out the limitations, and then move on to the next thing. So what you're looking at there is a stack of Arduinos, which you can go and buy from Maplin on the high street. You can throw it together very quickly and do something functional with it. And by going through those processes, you can start to eliminate the danger of theory, because so maybe you've got someone sat next to you in this room who's brilliant at theory. And I met a lot of people when we were working on this project who were brilliant at the theory of that can't be done, and no, that's not going to work. And I would say the best way to shoot those people down is to just get on with it and do it, and then they'll shut up. Because the theories don't tend to stand up in the real world. And it's amazing what you can do and what you can make work if you try hard enough. So by pulling together some consumer electronics and some clever thinking, which wasn't mine in this case, we very quickly got to the point where we were able to generate this map of the track. So what you're looking at there is a patch from a program called VVV or V4. It has multiple names. It's written by some very interesting German folks. And it's a unique programming environment, patch-based, node-based programming. So what you're looking at there takes the IMU data from either a phone or a sensor and puts it through a whole bunch of processing and spits out at the other end this virtual track, which looks like that. So we were able to do that pretty quickly by just getting on with it. And I had originally commissioned a guy who had the most incredible resume, a real conehead, and I say that in the nicest way possible. He was an uber geek, brilliant, and he just spent the whole time telling me why it wasn't going to work and why an IMU would never, it's too much drift and an IMU, this one. And so in the end, he moved on, and I got someone in who just said he'd have a go, and the result was that we got something that worked just brilliantly well. So that's some of the techie side of it. In terms of production, I think that same adage, fail fast and fail frequently, also applies. So what you're going to look at here is not going to be winning any Oscars anytime soon. It's also incredibly dark on there. So this is a Unity scene, which is what we used in the original development of what became Galactica. This was actually done before Galactica itself as a kind of a final creative concept fully evolved. And what we did was we grabbed a bunch of stuff from the Unity asset store, and we threw in some bits of our own that were done very, very quickly, as you can probably see. Really low poly stuff, relatively little care to texturing, lighting, rendering. This was, I don't know, this was a week or two for someone to be throwing some bits together, matching it to the movement of the track. And this was just to prove the concept that when you're on the coaster, if the motion syncs up, you're going to feel like you're moving through the space. It was for nothing more than that. This was not to win an award or blow anyone away. It was just to say, is it going to work? And this enabled us to have some media running on a ride in a few weeks, which, had we gone off and done lots of theory about what was going to work, what was going to be brilliant, and read all the reports and gone on the blogs, and we probably still would have been choosing what the theme should be. So we just got on with it with the most obvious thing, which was a bunch of rocks in space. Not the most inspiring, but completely proved the point and allowed us to see what worked, what didn't work, little things like how far away things are, how big things are in the scene. We could change them whilst we're standing on the platform, recompile it, get back on the ride and have another look. An even more impressive shot of lots of gaffer tape. Just quickly on something that some people within our own company didn't realize until our summer party this year is that we also developed all the hardware for the ride, which is quite funny because our CG team sits on one floor and lots of other people sit on the other floor. And at the end of a party this year, someone came up to me and said, you know, I worked on the media, I didn't realize that we made all of that hardware for it, which kind of blew me away. So what you can see here are some prototype headsets. one of the first things that we were really concerned about was safety and how you were going to not be throwing mobile phones off the ride and all that kind of stuff. So we started building all of these prototypes with a partner company. Again, we leveraged the fact that we could very quickly create a concept because I had a bunch of CG artists who were there with 3ds Max and Maya, and some of them have got product design backgrounds because, you know, we all come to this industry in different ways. So the guys with some product design experience immediately just started creating some models, and then we found the right company to help us build stuff quickly, and we went through lots of different prototypes. So that's May, June, July, August, September. And what you might notice there is it got simpler. And what we ended up with, in the case of Galactica, was even simpler still. Because there's lots of different drivers when you're working in a theme park. Hygiene's a massive issue when you're getting, you know, many, many hundreds of people an hour through that ride. So here you can immediately see that we have a waterproof but breathable material here. We have a wipeable material here with extra cushioning on the face mask because you want that thing on quite tight when you're going at 40 miles an hour upside down. We've got specially made tethers here to hold it onto the ride, permanently fixed on the ride, and custom-made cables with waterproof connectors, all sorts of stuff which is probably tediously boring to a lot of you in the room, but if that's not right, no one gets to see the lovely media that we've worked on. And we also developed things like a special box with touchscreen control for the operators, so every single seat has its own sensor, every single seat has its own processing, so everybody's independent of one another. And that doesn't matter, they all get the same experience, but what it means is that the movement of your row, which is very different on a coaster if you're at the back to the front, coaster geeks will know that, they all queue for the front or the back depending on the coaster. So all that's built into the box, and that connects through to the headset. We had to make custom pouches because if a seat's empty, you can't have this thing just drifting around in the rain, so it goes into a specially made pouch. So we found a company who makes helmets and gun cases for the army who helped us design these things. But the reason I'm showing you this is because we're a content production company, but we didn't have the platform upon which to deliver our content, so we made it. And I like that because I think that we all get into this industry because we want to make stuff. You know, usually it stays on a screen. Now it kind of feels a bit more than that in VR, but ultimately we're in the business of making things, so I don't think we should stop at pretty pictures. And I'll keep banging on about this, but there is a reason. One of the things that we did on Galactica, which was a really, really useful lesson, was that we did all of the stuff you've just seen, and then when we were going through the creative development process, we worked really closely with Merlin Magic Making, who look after all of the creative development across all of the Merlin estate, which includes all the theme parks and midway attractions like Two Swords and Sea Life and all those kind of places. So we worked with them and with the team at Alton Towers to get the creative treatment right. What was it going to be? What was going to appeal to the audience? What could be marketed well and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that we experienced with this was that we got stuck in a bit of a loop with development. And we went a really long way with developing storyboards. So I'm sure most of you in this room have seen storyboards. Here's some of our storyboards from Galactica. Lots of different ideas that were in the storyboards. And obviously the point with storyboards is that you can fail fast and fail frequently, and most importantly, if you're running a business, fail cheaply. However, what we found was that you can storyboard the hell out of something for about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, and then get on the ride and realize that it doesn't work on the ride, and you wish you'd started on the ride instead of started on paper. So I think some of the things that VR do for you is that they make you rewrite the textbook a little bit. Because the textbook says, do a treatment, write a script, do a storyboard, block it, then get into the really expensive work. And while some of that is almost certainly still true for some VR, I think because VR is kind of one-to-one with the real world, and the real world is full of variety, you've got to really look at what it is you're trying to do and make sure that you're going to match the experience in the world that that person's going to have with the content that they're going to see. If you're doing a kind of a walkthrough experience, most people have seen the Void video, which, you know, brilliant piece of marketing for all of our industry. Something where you walk through and feel like you're in another environment. or whether it's a ride, or whether it's just at home with your PlayStation VR, whatever it might be, I think you've got to think from the beginning about what is this going to feel like, rather than just how is the story going to flow. Because in VR, stories don't flow the way they did in the old world. So I think you've got to choose your approach depending on the project. And our approach from now on all coaster projects is to get straight on, take something like you saw before with our early Unity scene, and start iterating through that as quickly as possible. In fact, we've been doing that. We're working on a couple of projects around the world at the moment, and we're literally flying people out to these places, jumping on a coaster, riding it, getting off, changing things on a platform, changing things overnight, going back the next day and doing it again, with graphics that are real low grade, but that's our version of storyboarding. So these are some wireframes from some of the final media, because everyone likes wireframes. One of the things about VR in the context of Galactica, actually, which was a bit of a revelation to us, was that in the theme park industry, there are certain things that are inherent in the proposition. So, for instance, on a roller coaster, in most cases, they're gravity-driven. Most coasters, I didn't know this when I started working in theme parks, but most of the time, something gets you to a height, and the rest of the ride is just you coming down again. And that takes time. So on most coasters, most gravity coasters, there is what you call a lift hill, which is obviously that big run up to get to that height. And on most coasters, that's either the bit where you just reinforce your vertigo, or it's the bit where you're kind of bored and waiting to get going with the actual ride. What we found with VR is that that's almost the best bit of the ride. You know, from a content perspective, you've actually got time to just take stuff in, because they're never very fast, and you actually genuinely have time to get used to acclimatise yourself to VR, which is really useful. We talked about that 4-minute thing. We have about 40 to 60 seconds, really, depending on how the loading is on the ride. So that period of time, you want people to be able to look around and get used to being able to see different things. I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but I have certainly had the experience with VR of being frustrated that people don't look around. I was lucky enough to be invited to do a presentation at number 10 Downing Street in the big room with the big table and some really important people. And we were going around putting Gear VRs on people's heads. And it was a 360 experience, obviously, in the Gear VR. And I would put it on some guy's head, very important guy's head, and he would just sit there. So I would go up and I'd whisper in his ear, "Move your head, look to your left." And he still just didn't get it, you know. And everyone was like that. Well, most people were like that. And actually, on a coaster, to some extent, that matters less once you're moving. And it's certainly more natural when you're on the lift hill. You can really make the most of that and really have people enjoy it. And particularly from a story perspective, if you're being spun around and moved around very quickly, it's hard sometimes to tell a story. So you can get a lot of your storytelling done in the early stages of a ride as things are warming up. So we made a big point of creating a kind of a spaceport environment with lots of action in it, lots of robots. This is quite an early stage of this. There's things moving around, spacecraft taking off, using the height as well. Where's my slide? I missed it. We've got one bit where the floor opens up and you get to see down really long way. So playing with that sense of anticipation for being at height. You don't want to just lock someone in a little tube all the time. So on Galactica, we go off, we fly through the universe, go through several planets. Obviously, there's an emergency that you've got to get back from because it's a theme park. So there's a big explosion that happens, and you have to fly through the universe and get back safely. So, oh, there it is. There we go. So the key thing I wanted to say about this was really that my humble opinion on VR is don't just expect to do it the way you've done other stuff before. Try and get into the environment quickly. We're currently working a lot with HoloLens, and one of the things that Microsoft preach about working with HoloLens is to get involved with R&D and prototyping for the first sort of third of a project. Just do R&D and prototyping stuff, which is it's kind of what I think we end up doing anyway, but you sort of feel like you shouldn't. You feel like you should just be going straight into the proper job. And I think it's quite nice to realise that the R&D and prototyping stage is the real job. If you don't do that bit, the rest of it was probably going to go wrong or be very hard. So let me show you this. It's, as with a lot of things VR, seeing the actual VR content itself on a screen like this isn't that useful. So I'm going to show you the advert. Here we go.
Are you ready to experience interstellar space travel? Galactica, the universe's first roller coaster fully dedicated to virtual reality. Journey beyond the ride. Galactica, but now with Untitled Chapter.
Just one final thing on Galactica before I move on to the next one. The thing that we're probably all sick of hearing, if you work in VR, is about people being sick in VR. And I can tell you from a lot of evidence from the guys who run the ride that there is almost certainly less of an incidence of people being sick than there was before VR went on the ride. So as long as the synchronization works, then you're going to be good. Obviously, if the synchronization doesn't work, it's just as bad as downloading a roller coaster and sticking it on a cardboard. It's a hideous experience. Why do people do that as their first VR experience? But when you're one-to-one with the real world, as with room-scale VR, when you're moving around, there is not a sickness issue. And in fact, we get the great benefit of overcoming the locomotion problem that is often talked about. And I'm sure there's people in this room who've been dealing with that in the games industry. How do you move around big spaces in VR? Because you can't push a thumbstick and run at 40 miles an hour. So we're very lucky. We actually do get to throw you through the air at 40 miles an hour, twist you around, spin you upside down. So, yeah. Right, let's move on to Darren Brown. I've got a few videos and I'm conscious of time. So this was an interesting project. I was a huge fan of Darren's for a long time. I've read his books and seen his shows. And then I was invited to get involved in this project, which was like a dream come true. So I worked very closely with him. I was the show producer on this. I worked with him on everything from script through to directing the actors on set and walking around the ride and talking about all the things we wanted to do. So between us and Merlin Magic Making, who had the creative vision for the entire project and oversaw everything from the bricks on the wall outside through to working with us on content, Darren was there every step of the way. So I wondered going into this, would it really be him? Would he really be involved? And I think a lot of other people would just assume that sometimes people like Darren come along and just put their name on something, but that was not the case at all. Darren's a huge fan of horror films, and he really wanted to do something like this. He surprised me quite a lot with some of the things he wanted to do, but that's because I think he's that kind of guy. He doesn't stick to convention. So one of the key things about the Ghost Train is that when you walk into this beautifully themed environment, which is basically like an abandoned warehouse, in the middle of the warehouse, you see an old Victorian train carriage. It doesn't quite look like that, because this is from further in the ride, but there is an old Victorian train carriage that is suspended on chains floating in the middle of the room. And you go on, you have the experience, and in that experience, you have about 4.5 minutes with a HTC Vive headset on, and you feel the train moving, and then you get off, and then you walk around without the headset on. And then you go on another train, put another Vive headset on, and you have another 3 or 4 minute experience. And then you get off. When you get off, you walk back out the same train that hasn't moved, floating in the middle of the warehouse, which is the gag. But I think most people are so kind of mesmerized by what the hell just happened to me that they kind of walk out without realizing that this thing hasn't even moved behind them sometimes. So I'll let Darren say something about it.
Over the last 3 years, I have been working to completely reinvent the concept of the ghost train. People can expect a heart-stopping experience that includes grand movement, live action and special effects that will completely rewrite the rules of what theme parks can do. This experience will take you on a 13-minute journey through the field. My team is set to deliver a revolutionary experience, and guests will be left wondering where perception ends and reality
fully immersive, mind-blowing experience for every passenger.
Over 1,000 specialists have come together to create this experience, and I believe this represents the future for theme parks across the world.
It's a certain amount of hyperbole in that. I think it's a promo.
Are you ready? Are you ready?
Yes, we're ready. So, here's the timeline. I don't know if anyone's interested in something like a timeline, but I always kind of like to know how long something's taken somebody. So we first started working on this project in 2013. It had been going on a bit before we arrived on the scene, but it was still in the stages of what was it going to be, how was it going to work, was there going to be headsets involved and all that kind of stuff. And we worked through until opening in spring of this year. One of the things that the keen-eyed will observe is that when we first started working on scripts, we were back in, actually we kind of started really in 2013 on scripts. There was no HTC Vive, or the world didn't know about the HTC Vive. So we were working with Oculus Rift DK2s to begin with, and we were working towards both the creative challenge of how do we do something like this that's never been done before, but also the technical challenge of how the hell do we make this work. Right now, the Ghost Train has 173 HTC Vives running simultaneously across 3 trains, full-size tube carriages, real London Underground tube carriages, and they're all moving. So it wasn't lacking ambition, this project, particularly when you think that all that was starting to happen before the Vive even came out. So when I saw the Vive, I knew we had to use the Vive, because when you've got a carriage with nearly 60 people on it and every single one of them has a headset on, the tracking is a challenge. If you were doing this with a DK2 or with a Rift, you would have to have 60 cameras. That's not technically true, there are other ways of doing it. But back then we thought, okay, you're going to need 60 cameras facing you from the other side and then cabling it all back through the train. Horrible. So I'm not saying the Rift's horrible, by the way. It's a beautiful product, but not right for this. So we were able with this to track a train carriage which was moving with 60 people in it with just 6 lighthouses. And with lots of challenges along the way, because the Vive is not really supposed to work that way. And we hit lots of things that had to be overcome with the help of HTC and just with the brilliant team that we've got around us. Yeah. So along the way, here are some of the things that we learned. We learned that 4D video capture is not there yet. We learned that photogrammetry is very good, but it has its limitations. And we learned that facial motion capture and video projection is something else you should do R&D on. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So these were some early production tests, very much with the aim of failing fast, which we did. This is the University of Surrey. You've got a computer vision department, which is very illustrious. This is me doing a funny walk, followed by other people doing a funny walk. This video was done for our Christmas party, so it's much funnier if you work for us. So that first shoot you saw there, we had about 30 cameras, and we were using some cutting-edge software from the University of Surrey to then create a 4D video. Then we switched to doing some photogrammetry, facial motion capture. This is some other technical stuff that I'll probably skim over. It's pointing out that things like cleaning have to fit within an operational environment on a ride, which sounds boring, but if it doesn't happen, then we don't get to do the ride. So I wanted to talk about the photogrammetry element. The 4D video, there are people out there doing it like ATI and uncorporeal, but you've kind of got to fly to LA at the moment, or I believe they're getting a studio in London. But it's certainly not something that a lot of people can get access to. Photogrammetry is a lot easier than I think people realize. We built our own rig, which was with a single row of cameras, and then by buying a fairly cheap turntable, we were able to replicate having a full 125 camera photogrammetry studio, which worked really, really well. So all those cameras that you see there in Agisoft, they were actually just one row of 8, I think. Something like 8 cameras. And you can see that the results that we got out of that were really, really good. So we realized the 4D video wasn't there yet. We weren't going to be able to run with that. So we then moved on to the photogrammetry, and we learned something really interesting about VR production work, which is that most people expect VR, most normal people, i.e. not you, like normal people out there, they don't necessarily associate VR with game engines. So should it be Unreal, should it be Unity? They don't care. They think it's going to be real. So in fact, I've seen it happen in the theme park environment where someone's convinced their headset's broken because she can see pixels. And it's kind of shocking to realize that sometimes the general public don't just go, wow, that's amazing. They say, but I thought I was going to believe it was really real. And obviously, our aim is to make it feel like it's real. But one of the things that stops that from happening is the characters. So if you don't have characters, I'll just run this again, who look, move, talk, and emote completely realistically, then people don't buy that they're real. And you can have your kind of PlayStation 4 moment of, wow, look at the graphics, aren't they amazing? But the minute you're still saying graphics, you know it's not real. And in some environments, that's not good enough. Doesn't matter how great you can use Unreal to make things look, it's irrelevant. If someone knows it's not a real person, then in some cases they just won't accept it. And I also think that in terms of the wider entertainment industry, that's a challenge as well. Because if you've got Brad Pitt lined up for a shoot, do you want to end up with CG Brad Pitt, or do you want to end up with Brad Pitt? I probably should have gone the Angelina route, but you know, either way, there are people out there who are going to be paying massive money to use a star. They want it to be the star. They don't, in some circumstances, I'm not saying that for everything, because obviously we all know that what you can do with games engines today is amazing. But we had a situation here where we had a Vive on, and we were looking at these characters that you've just seen in this session here. You could walk up and look around them, and they looked incredible when they were static. They just looked amazing. But then you apply motion capture, and you try and deal with the facial stuff, and they still look amazing. And you go, wow, this is better than a AAA game. This is because we don't have to worry about polycounts so much. You know, we can get away with a lot because we can define the hardware. So there's a lot of things we can get away with. But the minute you still know it's not real, for some people, it's a problem. It's not good enough. So I'm going to show you some more how the production evolved. Some very, very early work on creature creation, fluid simulation tests and fairly basic stuff. Our demon evolved from a winged demon to a non-winged demon. Some animation tests, some early real-time tests. That's our demon who appears in the show. Some dynamics tests. And then here's where you see what we were doing with characters. So we went from photogrammetry with characters through to using multi-camera shoots. I'm just going to let this run. Okay. So what I wanted to say about that is that we ended up going through all of this work to find out that what really mattered to our clients in this job was they needed to see real people. Darren wanted to see real people. He wanted to be able to look at someone and know that's really a person there. So we ended up using a multi-camera approach, and we did that because we could. And again, we wouldn't have known that unless we tried it. If we'd sat in that environment, we soon found out that when you're on a train carriage with people either side of you, this kind of movement in VR doesn't happen. You know? And initially we had kind of restraints as well, which meant you couldn't move forward. And in fact, people naturally tend not to, especially if something scary is in front of them, they tend to go the other way. So we found that actually you needed a bit of lean VR, you needed a bit of this to be able to get some parallax within the scene, but you didn't need back of that guy. You didn't really need the side of him. So we could get away with filming it and putting it on billboards. We've used shaped billboards with stereo, high-res stereo video on. You know, if we didn't have the ability to use a dark environment because the mood and the theme of the thing was horror, the lights will go out. And if we didn't have that, then you would see he's got no feet, because we wanted the maximum pixel count to make him look as good as we could. So there's no lighting on the floor, and therefore we cut him off at the shins. So by being in the environment and trying it early, we could easily see where we could make wins and how we could get away with things that we might have otherwise not got away with. If this is a walkthrough experience, we couldn't have done it that way. So these are some of our characters, some of the shoots going on. This lady's lovely, her name's Virginia. She got on very well with Darren. This is actually her teeth. She was a rock and roll journalist and lost them in a mosh pit. I love that story. So on this project we used After Effects for some of the compositing work, and really the point of showing you this here is simply to show you how we could take one character here, move him into 3D, in this case Max, but we use Maya as well on the project. And you're seeing him here, I think you're seeing him on a flat billboard, but in some cases we actually had billboards that were shaped to match the seat so that when you did move, you got a sense of him being more three-dimensional. I'm nearly done. I just wanted to quickly show you that from what we've learned through doing the work we've done so far, we're now working on some interesting projects that we can't talk about, but I can show you a bit of this. We've got our rougher storyboards here. You'll notice that these storyboards are not worked up as much as some of the others that you saw. The reason is for that idea of fail fast, fail frequently. We didn't want to go to town on beautiful concept art, and actually we just wanted to figure out what we needed in the shots. But this is the reason that this is what I wanted to show you here. We've got a theory that if you're doing narrative cinematic VR, that 360 is a massive pain in the arse. Some of you may agree and some of you may not. But if you're trying to deliver to an audience that's sat in their sofa at home and doesn't want to walk around, doesn't want to be in the void or something, then most of the time they're going to be sat here, they're going to have some, you know, they might look. But to do that is actually, it's like that's a real pain. And we're really lazy. So one of the things that we've been working on is for different scenes, actually using the kind of the fulcrum of what you'd see and adapting the amount of the scene that you see. You know, it's been done in cinema for years that you could use wipes and stuff to focus people in different areas, or just lighting. You just light it so that you only see one area of the screen. So we started to look at that as a technique to help us tell the story without needing to create a bunch of stuff that no one really cares about. It's there if you want it from a story perspective. It's there if you want to see that thing and you need that thing. But we think that there's some scope to this idea that you don't necessarily need to be full 360 all the time. But the other reason for wanting to show you this stuff here is simply to say that blocking out your characters and blocking out your camera positions and the objects in your scene is so crucial. If you can do it by jumping into Unity or Unreal quickly and just having some blocks floating around and doing old-fashioned blocking, then that's priceless. That's really worthwhile. But equally, these kind of diagrams we think are really useful in VR to just realize what can the user see from that position, where are the actors going to move, where are the characters going to move. So I think what's happening, and I'm not saying this is some piece of genius, but what I am saying is that the tools that we all develop ourselves, from post-it notes through to cool storyboarding programs, they're evolving because of VR. And to be able to communicate to the production team you're working with the things they need to know, you need some new tools that haven't arrived yet. And some of them probably exist in that headset. And I think more and more will be working inside VR. I think I've reached the end. So that's it. Has anyone got any questions? Any questions? Have we got time for questions? Are we doing questions? I don't know. No? I must have explained it all brilliantly then. The other thing I would just say is that we are hiring, so if anyone's looking for jobs, by all means contact us through the website or come and have a chat with me or Alice here.